The sound of the LVT hitting the coral was an announcement of doom, echoing across the atoll. It was the sound of overwhelming machinery, a relentless grinding aggression that cared nothing for cover or casualty. When the Americans came, the Japanese Imperial soldier knew precisely what to expect: a deluge of steel, white-hot shrapnel, and the inexhaustible momentum of an industrial war machine that swallowed distance whole. This confrontation was terrifying, a battle against volume and brute force. They feared the young Marines' relentless wave-after-wave assault, the sheer unyielding energy of American power. But in the deep, rotting stillness of the Burma jungle, facing a different adversary, the emotion shifted entirely. There, the enemy didn't announce his arrival. There was no thunderous prelude, no massive naval curtain fire. Instead, there was a silence that carried the chill of ancient, perfected malice. The dread was the knowledge that the British soldier, camouflaged and invisible, understood the jungle better than they did, turning the environment itself into a weapon. They dreaded the tactical silence, the sudden, professional ambush that vanished as quickly as it struck, leaving behind only the chilling certainty of their own exposed vulnerability. The fear was the storm, the dread was the ghost. Today, we uncover the shocking truth about U.S. and British battlefield dominance and why the Imperial Japanese Army developed two entirely separate lexicon entries for these very different Allied enemies. That contrast between brute force and invisible finesse was the product of two nations fighting two fundamentally different wars, separated by distance, culture, and, most importantly, resource allocation. The military doctrines that defined the Pacific Campaign and the Southeast Asian theater evolved not just from different training manuals, but from entirely separate strategic premises imposed by the geography and the available tools of war. The American philosophy, honed in the island-hopping campaign, was inextricably linked to the gargantuan industrial capacity of the United States, an asset unmatched in human history. Every facet of the Pacific effort, from the colossal Essex-class carriers providing air cover to the overwhelming logistics strain that supported the landings, was a testament to this immense productive power. The Pacific War was fundamentally a logistical problem. Vast distances bridged by tiny, heavily fortified island strongholds that stood as fixed, critical objectives. The doctrine forged by the United States Marine Corps, the spearhead of this colossal effort, had to prioritize momentum over subtlety. There was little strategic value in protracted sieges or gentle maneuver warfare in places like Tarara, or Iwo Jima, or Okinawa. The mandate was to seize the critical airstrip or naval base as quickly as humanly possible. The aggression that the Japanese feared was therefore institutional and overwhelming rather than merely individual. It began long before the landing craft even lowered their ramps, commencing with naval guns the size of small cars, systematically reducing fortifications to rubble, often followed by dedicated waves of close air support that turned dense jungle positions into splinters and flame. The Japanese observer, hunkered down in a spider hole, was not primarily fighting men, but a relentless system of constant, escalating pressure. The American goal was always annihilation and speed, and the doctrine was built on the premise that no defense could long withstand the sheer, inexhaustible volume of fire and high-explosive ordnance that could be brought to bear, sustained, and replaced without pause.
When the Marines finally did arrive, their movements were merely the conclusion of this vast operational symphony. They moved in fire teams, supported by flamethrowers, recoilless rifles, and Browning automatic rifles carried forward by sheer, aggressive determination. Their training was specifically designed to push past the critical psychological point of combat exhaustion, to sustain the attack day and night, refusing the operational pause that any less well-supplied enemy might require or expect. This was the core of the American terror, a war of volume. Volume of steel, volume of fuel, and volume of bodies, designed to break the enemy's spirit by demonstrating a seemingly infinite, unyielding capacity to absorb, replace, and inflict violence at an unrelenting pace. It was a sledgehammer against a coral wall, and the Japanese knew that once the process began, it would not stop until the objective was secured, regardless of cost. This relentless, forward-driving force stood in stark opposition to the methods being forged in the deepest jungle trails of Southeast Asia.
The British experience in Southeast Asia, particularly the grueling Burma Campaign, demanded a completely different military calculus. Here, the challenge was not distance or fixed fortifications, but the terrain itself. The immense, sprawling theater, characterized by triple-canopy jungle, razor-backed ridges, and monsoon-swollen rivers, systematically negated the very advantage the Americans relied upon: massive mechanized support and overwhelming firepower. Heavy artillery and armor were often impossible to deploy or sustain, and the air support available was frequently limited by weather and jungle concealment. The British doctrine, especially after the initial catastrophic defeats, was therefore forced to prioritize survival, movement, and tactical self-sufficiency over brute strength. This war was not about taking ground quickly. It was about existing, moving, and fighting effectively in an environment that was actively trying to kill both the soldier and his technology. The primary opponent was not just the Japanese soldier, but the jungle itself, and the key to victory lay in mastering the latter to defeat the former. This led to the development of highly specialized infantry formations, exemplified by Ord Wingate's Chindits, and the general refinement of jungle warfare across the 14th Army, famously dubbed the Forgotten Army. The British realized they could not simply blast their way through. They had to infiltrate and evade, striking where they were least expected. This required an entirely different psychological profile and skill set. The British soldier was trained in meticulous concealment, silent movement, and prolonged deep penetration patrols, often operating for weeks or even months entirely behind enemy lines, supplied solely by airdrops. This doctrine turned the soldier into a predator, a component of the environment rather than an intruder against it. The tactical emphasis was shifted from overwhelming contact to the perfect ambush, where maximum destruction was achieved with minimal exposure. They fought not with the shock of volume, but with the paralyzing terror of uncertainty. The use of limited, highly accurate fire, booby traps, carefully laid mines, and a profound mastery of tracking and counter-tracking ensured that the Japanese could never truly rest or secure their supply lines. Where the American strategy was built around the principle of continuous frontal attack, the British strategy was built around the principle of total, continuous disruption, a psychological siege that eroded morale and logistical capability, one silent death at a time.
The result was a British fighting style that felt deeply personal, even insidious, to the Japanese defenders. It was a professional, invisible threat that stalked them in their own domain, the very antithesis of the loud, visible, but ultimately predictable American steamroller. These two divergent paths, one of overwhelming power, the other of chilling expertise, set the stage for the contradictory forms of fear they would instill in their common enemy.
The Japanese soldier, tasked with holding the line against the Allied advance, quickly learned to categorize the terror they faced. They differentiated between the enemy they could predict and the enemy they could not. And this psychological distinction became a crucial element of their after-action reporting. Facing the U.S. Marines in the cauldron of the Central Pacific was an encounter with the tangible. The American assault followed a clear rhythm: the preparatory bombardment, the landing, the establishment of the beachhead, and then the systematic explosive reduction of defenses. When Sergeant Kenji Moriarty recorded his experience on Peleliu, he didn't dwell on fear, but on exhaustion and noise. He described the air as permanently thick with dust and the metallic scent of cordite, the incessant churn of heavy machine guns, and the earth-shaking, predictable thump of mortar fire arriving every few seconds. The psychological impact of the U.S. assault was not derived from surprise, but from overload. The Americans rarely needed to outsmart their opponent. They simply needed to bring more equipment, more ammunition, and more men to bear, and to sustain that pressure for longer than the Japanese could endure. They would ignore flanks, relying instead on high-velocity rifle fire and concentrated short-range explosions to clear bunkers and pillboxes. The Marines' aggression, though individually reckless at times, was strategically coherent. Fix the enemy, apply maximum suppressive fire, and then move forward, cleaning up pockets of resistance with flamethrowers and demolition charges. The Japanese command understood this as a doctrine of sheer weight. They could count the ships, estimate the shells fired, and predict the axis of attack with reasonable certainty. It was an assault by a predictable, visible juggernaut, a terrible but rational opponent whose methods were rooted in logistics. Their reports emphasized the Americans' reliance on overwhelming material power, noting that the battle felt less like a contest of skill and more like a grim fight against an inescapable metallic tide. However, the experience of encountering the British forces in the jungle theaters of Asia, specifically in the deep penetration operations that came to define the later stages of the Burma Campaign, was fundamentally different. Here, the Japanese encountered not the fear of being overrun, but the paralyzing dread of invisibility. If the American attack was a symphony of thunder, the British strike was a single, fatal note played in perfect silence. The British approach prioritized the elimination of command, communication, and supply, the nervous system of the enemy, before engaging the body. When a British patrol struck, the effects were immediately confusing. A sentry might vanish, a radio operator might be found with his throat expertly cut, or a carefully cached rice dump would be sabotaged, leaving no trace of the attacker. The fighting was not about beachheads. It was about trails, riverbanks, and the sudden, terrifying realization that the enemy had been watching them for days, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. The British forces, particularly those units operating under the long-range penetration strategies, did not seek a decisive, head-on engagement. They sought to bleed the enemy slowly, systematically, and from within the very sanctuaries the Japanese had carved out for themselves. The soldiers of the 14th Army had undergone a fundamental retraining, shedding the conventional methods of trench warfare and embracing the principles of the hunter. Their jungle training included not only advanced navigation and survival skills, but also the psychological inversion of the Japanese fighting spirit. The Nipponese soldier prided himself on his ability to endure and utilize the terrain for defense. The British soldier turned this endurance into a liability, using the terrain to conceal his offense. This meant that when contact was finally made, it was invariably on British terms. A Japanese supply column moving confidently along a seemingly deserted trail might suddenly find its lead and rear elements silenced simultaneously by precise, overlapping Bren gun fire and expertly placed grenades, the attackers melting back into the foliage before return fire could even be coordinated. The contrast in the nature of the fear was profound, and it spoke volumes about the resources and training applied to each theater. The Marine, backed by endless logistical might, was a shockwave, terrifying in his immediate presence, but his methods were predictable. The Marine fought the Japanese in the open, or at least in the confines of a bunker system, and once the barrage lifted, the Japanese knew the rules of engagement. Conversely, the British jungle fighter was a spectre. His attack was deeply personal, signaling a total compromise of security. In a captured diary entry from a Japanese officer fighting near Kohima, a chilling verdict was offered. The Americans bring the storm, we can shelter, but the English bring the sickness that eats you from the inside. You cannot see the disease until the fever takes you. This sickness was the constant, gnawing anxiety that every shadow concealed a sniper, that every moment of rest was a moment of mortal exposure. This tactical disparity was reflected in the Japanese efforts to counter each force. Against the U.S. Marines, Japanese commanders poured resources into concrete and steel, maximizing firepower density in depth, banking on the idea that they could inflict such high casualties that the American logistical chain, however large, would eventually stagger. They fought a war of attrition, believing that if they endured the initial kinetic onslaught, they could break the enemy's will. However, against the British in Burma, counter-tactics were radically different. They were forced to disperse, constantly check their own lines of retreat, and devote massive manpower to counter-patrolling and security sweeps, a war of paranoia and exhaustion. The American aggression shattered the fortifications. The British tactics shattered the coherence of command. While the U.S. approach systematically destroyed the enemy's physical defenses, the British approach successfully undermined the enemy's sense of control over the battlefield. When forced to retreat, the psychological differences became even starker. Retreating from an American assault was a desperate sprint under continuous shelling, a physical rush to escape the zone of fire, leaving behind mounds of dead and shattered equipment. Retreating from a British-dominated area meant an entirely different kind of horror. It was a slow, agonizing trek through monitored territory where booby traps, snipers, and ambush parties were the primary threat. Every stream crossing, every narrow defile became a potential coffin, and the Japanese realized that the British were not just fighting them for ground, but for control of the psychological terrain, turning every foot of jungle into a trap. This existential dread forced the Japanese soldier to look over his shoulder, to trust no sound, and to expend crucial mental energy simply maintaining a state of alert exhaustion. The American attack necessitated courage. The British threat demanded nerves. One was designed to break the body through bombardment, the other was designed to break the mind through perpetual, unseen menace. This divergence in tactical outcome and psychological impact had immediate and lasting consequences for how the Axis powers perceived and reacted to the growing power of the Allied coalition. Which one truly broke enemy lines?
The profound operational contrast between the American and British approaches did not go unnoticed by the Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo. Far from being seen as merely localized differences, the distinct Allied doctrines forced a massive strategic re-evaluation of resource deployment and defensive priority throughout the entire Pacific and Southeast Asian sphere. Japanese military intelligence reports, increasingly panicked toward the later stages of the war, meticulously documented these differences, recognizing that they represented two separate yet equally lethal ways of waging total war. Against the American aggression, the Japanese response was the creation of the deep defense strategy, most famously articulated by General Tadamichi Kuribayashi on Iwo Jima. This tactical change was a direct countermeasure to the overwhelming American material superiority. Knowing they could not defeat the U.S. forces on the beaches or match their volume of fire, the Japanese stopped relying on futile banzai charges and coastal resistance. Instead, they transformed entire islands into vast interconnected networks of fortified caves, underground bunkers, and covered positions. The new objective was not to hold the ground, but to maximize the time and casualties required to secure it, aiming to bleed the American logistical and political will to continue the advance. This required incredible engineering effort and a shift in mindset. The soldier was now expected to fight, die, and inflict damage from within a subterranean labyrinth, accepting that a final counterattack was impossible. This was the only viable response to the Marine Corps' relentless, fire-supported, forward-driving steamroller. Conversely, the Japanese reaction to the British jungle tactics in Burma was one of constant, dispersed paranoia rather than concentrated defense. The challenge was not overpowering volume, but the infiltration of deep penetration units like the Chindits, who destabilized rear areas, destroyed supply dumps, and rendered lines of communication unreliable. The Imperial Army was forced to divert entire divisions away from the front lines to conduct perpetual, exhausting anti-infiltration and security sweeps through their own claimed territory. This operational requirement proved incredibly costly, stretching manpower thin and drastically reducing the effective combat power available for frontal resistance. A British force of a few thousand Chindits, supplied entirely by air, could tie up 10 times their number of Japanese soldiers who were forced to hunt them in their own jungle domain. The doctrine of the ambush and self-sufficiency, honed by the British, thus had a far more corrosive effect on the overall coherence of the Japanese operational plan than simply being defeated in a set-piece battle. The British approach proved to be a low-cost, high-leverage method of fracturing the enemy's logistical spine, whereas the American method required the expenditure of stupendous resources to achieve the same result. The Japanese thus found themselves fighting two different wars, each demanding a specialized and resource-intensive counter-tactic, and this dual-front psychological and material pressure ultimately hastened their defeat. The strategic realization of these disparate strengths led to a crucial evolution in Allied cooperation. effectively merging the American industrial speed with the British tactical finesse into a single, unstoppable coalition force. While the U.S. and British forces rarely fought side by side in the same theater, their contrasting operational successes created a perfect strategic dilemma for the Axis command. The Americans, by demonstrating the ability to project overwhelming, sustained force across immense distances, effectively pinned the Japanese main naval and defense assets to the critical island chains, compelling the Imperial Navy to deplete its resources in defense of fixed strategic positions. The very threat of the American sledgehammer campaign, the sheer scale of their amphibious power, dictated the location of Japanese reserves. Meanwhile, the British, fighting what was essentially a campaign of internal hemorrhage in Burma, capitalized on this strategic distraction. Because the Japanese were forced to conserve their best units and resources to counter the inevitable American large-scale landings, the British were able to perfect and execute their deep penetration tactics against a Japanese field army that was perpetually undersupplied and suffering from the tropical environment. The success of the British, therefore, lay in their ability to draw resources away from the primary defensive lines through low-signature, high-impact operations. General Slim's 14th Army, for example, could not have achieved their eventual victory had the Japanese been able to dedicate their full strategic weight to the Southeast Asian theater. The American War of Concentration facilitated the British War of Dispersion and vice versa. Post-war analysis and intelligence reports confirmed that the combined effect was greater than the sum of its parts. Japanese war diaries frequently note the exhaustion caused by facing the American offensive, only to be followed by the demoralization of having to deploy resources internally to fight a ghost war against the British. The American approach provided the decisive kinetic victory. The British approach provided the strategic disruption that made that victory achievable with fewer overall Allied losses in Asia. This contrast led directly to long-term doctrinal influence after the war. The U.S. military, while retaining its emphasis on superior firepower, began to heavily incorporate specialized jungle and counterinsurgency training, adopting many of the small-unit, self-sufficient patrol techniques pioneered by the British in Burma. Conversely, the British, watching the overwhelming success of American logistics, worked to modernize and expand their own capacity for rapid, material-heavy deployment, ensuring that tactical finesse was eventually backed by industrial muscle. The enemy's fear, therefore, taught the Allies a final, crucial lesson: that material power is most effective when complemented by tactical invisibility, and that strategic victory often requires both the hammer blow and the surgeon's scalpel. This convergence of military thought marked a critical turning point in how Western armies prepared to fight in non-European environments, forever blending the relentless push of the Marine with the silent mastery of the jungle soldier. The ultimate revelation of this comparative study is not which side was inherently better, but how two vastly different national philosophies of war, one born of industrial abundance and manifest destiny, the other of imperial tradition and tactical survival, created a perfect complementary instrument of destruction. The Japanese felt the Marines' aggression as a tidal wave, a sudden, inescapable reckoning fueled by the smokestacks of Detroit and Pittsburgh. This kinetic shock reflected the American genius for scale, speed, and logistical overkill. But they felt the British tactics as a creeping malignancy, an existential threat that dismantled their internal stability, which reflected the British genius for adaptation, stealth, and a profound professional intimacy with the forgotten corner of the globe they were tasked with defending. The fear of the Marine was an acknowledgement of their own material weakness. The dread of the British soldier was a recognition of a spiritual and tactical mastery they could not match on their own chosen ground. In this duality lay the true strength of the Allied coalition. They presented the enemy not with one single problem, but with an impossible matrix of contradictory threats. If the Japanese concentrated their forces to resist the American onslaught, they exposed their deep flanks and supply lines to the British infiltration. If they dispersed to secure their rear areas from the British, they guaranteed the immediate collapse of their forward defenses against the American torrent. The enemy's ability to adapt was constantly defeated by the Allies' ability to diversify. This tension between the thunderous visible hammer and the invisible silent dagger is what ultimately broke the spine of the Imperial Japanese Army, leaving behind a legacy that defines the very essence of coalition warfare, proving that ultimate dominance is achieved not through uniformity, but through the sophisticated blending of necessary extremes. The two forms of terror, woven together, forged the definition of an unstoppable opponent.